The storm clouds rolled over the small rural town with a heaviness that mirrored the feeling in Officer Daniel Hale's chest. The night shift was usually quiet on the outskirts, routine patrols, the occasional lost traveler, or a call about a raccoon rummaging through someone's trash. But tonight felt different, as if the wind itself carried a warning. Thunder rumbled low across the dark fields, and the fading twilight cast an eerie glow across the abandoned train line that cut through the far edge of the county. Daniel rested his hand on the head of his canine partner, a German shepherd named Rocco, who sat alert in the front seat beside him. Rocco was more than a partner. He was Daniel's anchor, the one creature who had remained loyal after every hardship life had thrown. As the patrol car inched along the gravel path parallel to the rail tracks, Rocco suddenly stiffened, his ears shooting upright, his eyes locked into the distance with unblinking intensity. Without warning, he let out a deep, urgent growl that Daniel had learned to never ignore. Something was wrong, terribly wrong, and Rocco felt it before Daniel even saw it. If you believe in kindness, second chances, and stories that remind us of humanity's best moments, make sure to like, comment, share, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps these powerful, real-life inspired stories reach more hearts. An unexpected gust of cold wind pushed against the patrol car, and then the next instant, Rocco lunged toward the windshield, barking sharply, repeatedly, as if pleading for Daniel to follow his lead. Daniel's heart began to race. He pulled over abruptly, his boots sinking slightly into the wet earth as he opened the door. Rocco didn't wait for a command. He leapt out, nose to the ground, then suddenly sprinted toward the old railway bridge a few hundred yards away. Daniel followed, breath catching in his throat with each step. The darkness around them seemed to tighten. The air smelled faintly of metal and rain, and the only sounds were Rocco's paws pounding the earth and the distant groan of wind against rusted steel. As they approached the tracks, Daniel saw something that made his stomach drop. Shadows shifting in a way that wasn't natural, a flicker of movement on the rails. When Rocco bounded onto the tracks just beneath the bridge, Daniel instantly felt the weight of what he was seeing. A small figure, motionless at first glance, then trembling with barely visible shivers. It was a child, a girl no older than 8, and she was tied to the tracks with rough, frayed rope cutting into her wrists. Her mouth was taped, her hair was tangled from the wind. Her eyes were wide with terror, tears streaking down her dirt-stained cheeks as she struggled weakly. Daniel's breath left him in a harsh exhale. His hand shook as he rushed forward. He felt the vibrations of the rails beneath his knees, the faint, unmistakable tremor of an approaching train somewhere down the line. Panic surged up his spine. Rocco whimpered urgently, circling the girl, nudging her gently with his nose, then barking at Daniel, demanding he hurry. The girl tried to move, but the ropes were too tight, digging into her small arms. Rain began to fall in thin, cold droplets, each one snapping Daniel back into focus. He reached for his pocket knife, fingers trembling as adrenaline surged through him like electricity. The ropes were tight, far too tight. Whoever had tied her there had done it with deliberate cruelty. The closer he looked, the clearer it became that this was no accident. The knots were precise, professional even, like someone who had practiced or planned this carefully. Daniel's stomach twisted with a mixture of fury and dread as he slashed through the first rope. Rocco planted himself at the edge of the tracks, ears pinned back, body trembling with agitation. The rails vibrated again, this time stronger. Daniel could hear it now, the faint horn in the distance, the low rumble of unstoppable steel moving closer through the darkening storm. He cut faster, hands slick with rain and sweat. The girl tried to pull her knees up, her muffled sobs breaking Daniel's heart. The knife slipped once, slicing into his own hand, but he didn't stop. Not for a second. He tore through the last rope and then scooped her up into his arms as Rocco barked frantically. Just as Daniel ran off the tracks, clutching the little girl against his chest, the train burst into view around the bend, roaring like a beast through the storm. The wind from its speed nearly knocked him off his feet. Rocco jumped aside at the last second, his fur whipping back from the blast of rushing air. Daniel held the child tightly, breathing hard, watching the train scream past with only seconds to spare. His knees felt weak. His heart hammered against his ribs so violently he thought it might burst. But she was alive, terrified, cold, barely able to speak, but alive. When the train finally roared off into the distance, leaving behind only the fading echo of metal on metal, Daniel gently set the girl down and pulled the tape from her mouth. She gasped like she'd been underwater for hours, clinging to Rocco, burying her face into his fur with desperate gratitude. Her small voice trembled as she whispered her first words to him, her breath shaky, her body still trembling uncontrollably. She refused to let go of Rocco, as if she feared the world would swallow her again if she loosened her grip. Daniel wrapped her in his jacket and carried her back toward the patrol car. He called for backup, his voice tight and breathless. But as he listened to her broken whispers on the way, as she finally began to speak in short, terrified fragments, the truth began to unravel. Slowly at first, then violently, tearing through every assumption Daniel had made. The girl wasn't a victim of a random attack. She hadn't wandered off. She hadn't been kidnapped by a stranger lurking in the woods. No, her story was far more chilling. Through sobs and stammers, she revealed that the person who had tied her to the tracks was someone she knew, someone she trusted, someone who had convinced her that she deserved it. It was her mother's boyfriend, someone who had slowly poisoned the mother's mind with lies, someone who had become increasingly controlling, unpredictable, and cruel. He had blamed the child for every inconvenience, every argument, every imagined slight. He convinced her mother that the girl was the problem, that she brought bad luck, that she needed discipline. The mother, exhausted and manipulated, had turned a blind eye to the emotional wounds forming in her daughter's heart. But tonight, everything escalated beyond anyone's darkest expectations. The man had taken the girl out under the pretense of a lesson, claiming he would teach her how to be quiet and obedient. Instead, he brought her to the tracks under the looming storm clouds, tied her down, and walked away. The child said he told her the thunder would drown out her cries, and that no one ever came this far at night. He wanted her gone. He wanted the mother to believe she had wandered off on her own. He wanted the police to conclude it was a tragic accident. Daniel's stomach churned with rage as her shaky words spilled out. He glanced back at Rocco through the rearview mirror, silently thanking him for senses that no human could ever possess. If Rocco hadn't reacted when he did, if Daniel had been even a minute later, the truth would have been buried beneath twisted metal, storm clouds, and the smooth excuses of a manipulative man. The girl fell asleep in the patrol car, her small body finally giving in to exhaustion. But Daniel drove with renewed determination. Backup cars arrived. Medics checked her. Rocco refused to leave her side, lying next to her on the blanket they had laid out in the ambulance, resting his head gently beside her arm. When her mother arrived, sobbing, shaking, broken by guilt, Daniel saw a woman who wasn't cruel, but controlled, trapped in her own cycle of fear. And as the truth came out, as officers moved into position to arrest the boyfriend, her mother collapsed into tears, realizing what she had allowed, what blind trust had cost her. The arrest was swift, the evidence was overwhelming, but what lingered most was not the horror of what almost happened, but the small, powerful moments of tenderness that followed. The girl began visiting the station in the days afterward, always looking for Rocco, who greeted her with soft whimpers and gentle nudges. She smiled for the first time in weeks while brushing his fur. Daniel watched her slowly transform from fragile to resilient, from fearful to hopeful. She started therapy, her mother sought help, and though they had a long road ahead, the darkness that had once hovered over their lives began to lift, little by little. Months later, the town held a small ceremony to honor Daniel and Rocco. The girl, now brighter and stronger, stood on the small stage with Rocco beside her. She held his badge ribbon in her hands as if it were the most important treasure she owned.
When she spoke, her voice trembled not with fear, but with gratitude strong enough to make the whole room fall silent. It wasn't just a rescue. It wasn't just luck. It was the story of a life saved at the last possible second, and the ripple of healing that followed.